In the dusty heart of Colorado Territory, 1883, where hope withered faster than autumn leaves and mercy was scarcer than mountain gold, some stories began with the sound of gavels falling and hearts breaking in silence. This is one of those stories, about a debt that couldn't be settled with coins, a woman who held her baby like a shield against the world's cruelty, and a rancher who saw worth where others saw only burden. Elena Rodriguez had never imagined that her husband's gambling debts would lead to this moment. Standing in the scorching sun outside Copper Creek's courthouse steps, her infant daughter Sophia clutched to her chest, while the auctioneer's voice rang out like a death knell. The men around her spoke as if she were livestock, as if she couldn't understand the transaction about to tear her world apart. They were wrong about many things, but they were right about one. Elena was different from the broken women who usually found themselves on auction blocks. Cole Brennan, 35 years old and carrying ghosts that whispered in the Colorado wind, had come to town for supplies and solitude. He hadn't planned on witnessing the sale of a human soul. But when he saw her, this young mother who stood silent but unbroken, whose dark eyes held secrets deeper than mountain caves, something shifted in his chest like an avalanche waiting to fall. Some debts can only be paid with kindness. Some rescues happen not with grand gestures, but with the quiet decision to see someone as worthy of love when the whole world has declared them worthless. The September sun beat down on Copper Creek's courthouse square like a blacksmith's hammer, turning the packed earth into a furnace that baked through boot leather and scorched the air above the wooden sidewalks. The quarterly debt auction was reaching its climax, with desperate souls being bartered like livestock, while a crowd of spectators gathered to witness misfortune transform into opportunity. Cole Brennan sat his horse at the edge of the crowd, watching through eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. His weathered hands rested easy on the saddle horn, but everything about his posture spoke of a man coiled tight as a spring. 5 years of solitary living had carved lines deeper into his face, etched by Colorado wind and harder truths. He'd built his ranch into a sanctuary of silence, a place where a man could wrestle with his demons without an audience. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the afternoon air like a whip. Next lot, folks. Elena Rodriguez, age 24, an infant child, Sophia, recently widowed, bound by territorial law to settle her late husband's gambling obligations through 7 years of indentured service. Cole's jaw tightened involuntarily. He'd heard about debt auctions. Every rancher in 3 counties knew the law. But seeing it was different. The legal books called it obligation settlement, a clean way to say that when a man died owing more than he owned, his family could be sold to work off the balance. She stood on the platform like a Madonna carved from mountain stone. Elena Rodriguez couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds, but she held herself with a dignity that circumstances couldn't diminish. Her black hair was pulled back in a braid that caught the sunlight, and though her brown dress was faded and patched, she wore it like armor. Dark eyes, the color of coffee beans, gazed out over the crowd without pleading, without fear, but with a quiet defiance that made Cole's breath catch. In her arms, she held a baby that couldn't have been more than 10 months old. Sophia slept through the chaos, tiny fist curled against her mother's breast, oblivious to the fact that her future was being decided by strangers with dirty money and empty hearts. Mrs. Rodriguez worked as a seamstress before her marriage, the auctioneer continued, consulting his papers. Literate, healthy, excellent with needle and thread. Child appears robust as well. Husband died in a mining accident up in the Silver Camps. Left behind considerable gambling debts to the Copper Creek Merchants Association. Cole knew about the Rodriguez situation. Most folks did. Miguel Rodriguez had been a dreamer and a fool, betting on silver claims that never paid out and poker hands that never came up right. When a cave-in crushed him last spring, it left behind a widow, a baby, and enough debt to strangle a mule. Let's start the bidding at $40, the auctioneer called. Silence stretched across the square like a held breath. $40 was decent money for 7 years of work, but everyone knew what they were really buying. A young woman alone with a baby was vulnerable in ways that made decent men examine their consciences and indecent men lick their lips. Come now, gentlemen, the auctioneer pressed. Look at that bone structure. She'll fill out with proper feeding, and the child's young enough to train right. Cole felt his stomach turn. The way the man spoke, like he was selling breeding stock instead of human beings. Elena's face had gone pale, but she kept her chin up, scanning the crowd with those defiant eyes, memorizing faces, perhaps planning which ones to haunt in their dreams. 35, called a voice from the back. Jeremiah Hawk, a farmer from the valley who'd buried two wives already under suspicious circumstances. His smile was cold enough to freeze summer. 30, shouted another bidder. This one belonged to Samuel Bronson, who owned the largest saloon in town and half the cribs behind it. His girls had a way of disappearing after a year or two, usually in the middle of the night with nothing but terror in their eyes. Elena's composure cracked at Bronson's bid. Her arms tightened around Sophia, and for the first time, real fear flickered across her features like lightning in a storm cloud. The bidding picked up momentum, voices calling out numbers while Elena stood frozen in the center of it all, a deer surrounded by wolves. Cole watched her face cycle through emotions: fear, disgust, resignation. She was trapped and everyone knew it. The law didn't care about her feelings, only the debt that needed settling. $50, Bronson called, his voice oily with satisfaction. Final offer, and I'll throw in room and board for the child too. The crowd chuckled at that, the kind of ugly laughter that meant everyone understood exactly what kind of room and board Bronson was offering. Elena's face went white as fresh snow, and Sophia stirred in her arms, sensing her mother's distress. Cole had seen enough. He'd watched good men do nothing while evil flourished, had stood by while the weak were devoured by the strong. Not today, not again. The memory of Isabella's face flashed before his eyes. Another woman, another time when he'd been too late to matter. $150, he called out, his voice cutting through the chatter like a blade through silk. The square went silent as a graveyard. $150 was more money than most men saw in 2 years, enough to buy a prize bull or a season's worth of premium supplies. For an indenture contract, it was unheard of, crazy money that suggested either desperation or hidden motives. The auctioneer blinked owlishly, clearly struggling to process the bid. "Did you say 150, Mr. Brennan?" Cole straightened in his saddle. "That's right, 150 for both the woman and child. Cash money." Bronson spun around, his face flushed red with rage and confusion. "You can't be serious, Brennan. That's throwing good money after bad. What possible use could you have for domestic help? Your place barely sees visitors from 1 month to the next." Cole met his gaze steadily, reading the frustration and greed warring in the man's eyes. "My money, my choice, Bronson. Unless you're prepared to bid higher." 200, Bronson snarled, the words bitter as wormwood on his tongue. Cole didn't hesitate. 300. A murmur rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. This wasn't how these things usually went. Dead auctions were supposed to be efficient affairs where desperate people went to practical bidders at reasonable prices. Cole Brennan was turning it into something else entirely, a battle of wills fought with currency instead of fists. Elena was staring at him now, those coffee-dark eyes trying to read his intentions like a fortune teller reading tea leaves. She'd probably learned not to trust men who made grand gestures. In her experience, they usually came with prices attached that were worse than the original problem. "Going once," the auctioneer called, his voice uncertain. The numbers being thrown around had exceeded his wildest expectations. Bronson's face twisted with calculation and rage. $300 was serious money, the kind that could buy silence, compliance, or revenge. But it was also more than even his twisted appetites were worth paying. "Going twice," the auctioneer continued. Cole reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather pouch heavy with gold coins. He'd been saving for years, scraping together every penny from cattle sales and careful living. The money represented his security, his independence, his ability to live without needing anything from anyone. But sometimes a man had to pay for his principles. "Sold," the auctioneer called, relief evident in his voice, "to Cole Brennan for $300. The crowd began to disperse, voices rising in excitement and speculation. Cole ignored them all, his attention focused on the woman and child, who were now, by law, his responsibility. He dismounted slowly and walked to the platform, acutely aware that every person in the square was watching his next move. Elena's eyes followed him as he approached, wary and calculating. She'd stopped trembling, but her grip on Sophia had tightened until her knuckles showed white through olive skin. "Mrs. Rodriguez," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Cole Brennan. I have a ranch about 20 miles north of here." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Whatever she found there must have surprised her, because some of the tension left her shoulders. "I know who you are," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a slight accent that spoke of Spanish heritage. "You're the hermit from Eagle's Rest Ranch." Cole nodded. His reputation in Copper Creek was simple enough. He kept to himself, paid his bills, and didn't cause trouble. What people didn't know about were the nightmares that still woke him in cold sweats, or the reason he'd chosen to live 20 miles from his nearest neighbor. "Your daughter?" he asked, nodding toward the bundle in her arms. "Sophia," Elena replied, a hint of warmth creeping into her voice for the first time. "She's 10 months old." Sophia's a beautiful name for a beautiful child. Cole glanced around the square where knots of people were forming to discuss this unexpected turn of events. "We should go. Townfolk have seen enough entertainment for one day." Elena nodded but didn't move. "Mr. Brennan," she said carefully, "I need to understand something. What exactly do you expect from me?" It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd opened his mouth to bid. The indenture contract gave him legal ownership of her labor for 7 years, along with the right to house, feed, and direct her work as he saw fit. On paper, she was little more than property. "I expect you to help me run a ranch," he said simply. "Cook, clean, tend the garden, help with the animals when needed. Nothing more, nothing less." "And if I can't, if I'm not strong enough for the work?" Cole looked at her, really looked. She was thin, probably hadn't had a decent meal in weeks, but there was steel in her spine and fire in her eyes, the kind that didn't break easy under pressure. "You're stronger than you think," he said, "and strength can be built with proper food and rest." He held out his hand to help her down from the platform. She hesitated for a moment, then shifted Sophia to one arm and accepted his assistance. Her fingers were rough from work but delicate, and he could feel them trembling slightly as she stepped down onto solid ground. The crowd parted as they walked toward his horse, conversations dying as they passed. Cole could feel the weight of their stares, the whispered speculations that would follow this day for months to come. A man didn't pay $300 for a woman and child without expecting something in return, and Copper Creek's residents would spend considerable time trying to figure out what that something might be. As they reached his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Thunder, Cole made a decision that surprised them both. "Can you ride?" he asked. Elena nodded. "I grew up on a farm, been in the saddle since I was Sophia's age." "Good." He untied the reins and held them out to her. "You take Thunder, I'll walk." She stared at him in amazement. "That's your horse, and now he's yours to use. Ranch work requires mobility, and walking 20 miles with a baby wouldn't be practical for anyone." Elena accepted the reins with obvious reluctance, still trying to process this stranger who'd upended her world with his incomprehensible bid. She managed to mount despite Sophia in her arms, settling into the saddle with practiced ease that spoke of her farm upbringing. Cole began walking toward the road that led out of town, his long strides eating up the distance with mechanical precision. Behind them, Copper Creek buzzed with excitement over the morning's unexpected drama. Ahead lay 20 miles of open country and the beginning of something neither of them fully understood. Sophia chose that moment to wake up, opening dark eyes that mirrored her mother's. She looked around with the serious curiosity of the very young, taking in this new world of horse and sky and the strange man walking beside them with quiet authority. "She's beautiful," Cole said, and meant it. Elena's expression softened slightly. "She's everything good I have left in this world." They left Copper Creek behind them as the sun climbed higher, painting the Colorado landscape in shades of gold and amber. For the first time in months, Elena Rodriguez dared to hope that the road ahead might lead somewhere better than where she'd been. The road from Copper Creek wound through country that seemed carved from God's own imagination. Red rock formations jutting skyward like ancient cathedrals, Stands of aspen and pine clinging to steep slopes, and valleys so wide and empty they made a person feel both infinitely small and strangely significant. Elena rode Thunder with natural grace, her body moving with the horse's rhythm as if she'd been born to the saddle. She hadn't spoken since they'd left town, but Cole found her silence comfortable rather than awkward. It was different from the heavy, expectant quiet that usually followed him around settlements, where people waited for him to fill empty air with meaningless conversation. Elena's silence felt purposeful, observant, as if she were cataloging every detail of the landscape and filing it away for future reference. They paused at a creek to water Thunder and rest in the shade of a massive cottonwood. Cole dismounted first, then offered his hand to help Elena down. She accepted his assistance with a slight nod of thanks, her fingers brief and warm against his palm before she stepped away to examine their surroundings, with the cautious awareness of someone who'd learned that safety was never guaranteed. Cole watched her as she moved to the creek's edge, kneeling gracefully to cup water in her hands. There was something almost ethereal about the way she carried herself, graceful but alert, like a deer that knows predators might be watching, but refuses to be ruled by fear. When she finished drinking, she remained crouched by the water, her head tilted as if listening to something he couldn't hear. "We'll be at Eagle's Rest before sunset," Cole said, settling down on a fallen log and pulling jerky from his saddlebags. "It's not much to look at compared to town spreads, but it's home." Elena turned to look at him, and Cole was struck again by the intensity of her gaze. Her dark eyes seemed to take in not just his words but something deeper, his intentions perhaps, or the sincerity behind his promise of sanctuary. He held out a piece of jerky, and she approached slowly, taking it with another of those small, formal nods that suggested she'd been raised with manners, despite her current circumstances. As she ate, Cole found himself talking, filling the silence with details about his ranch, his cattle, the small house he'd built with his own hands after buying the land 6 years ago. "My nearest neighbor is old Fernando Vega, about 4 miles west," he said. "Good man, keeps to himself mostly. His wife Maria makes the best tamales this side of Santa Fe. You'll like her, I think. She doesn't ask a lot of questions." Elena's head turned sharply at the mention of questions, and Cole realized he'd struck something significant. In the brief moment before she looked away, he saw something flicker across her features. Not fear exactly, but a wariness that spoke of too many interrogations, too many people trying to understand what they couldn't comprehend. "I'm not much for questions myself," Cole added quietly. "Figure a person will tell you what they want you to know when they're ready to tell it." Elena's shoulders relaxed slightly, and she turned back to him with what might have been the beginning of trust. Sophia had awakened and was making soft baby sounds, reaching tiny fingers toward the dancing patterns of light and shadow filtering through the cottonwood leaves. They remounted and continued north as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The land grew wilder here, less touched by human presence, and Cole felt some of the tension he'd been carrying since town began to ease. This was his world, open country where a man could breathe freely and think clearly, where the problems of settlements and society seemed distant and manageable. As they crested a low ridge, Eagle's Rest came into view below them. It wasn't much by most standards: a modest log house with a stone chimney, a barn and corral, a small bunkhouse, and enough grazing land to support 200 head of cattle. But it was his, built with his own sweat and dreams, and he felt a familiar swell of pride as he pointed it out to Elena. "There it is," he said. "Home." Elena leaned forward slightly in the saddle, studying the buildings and the land beyond, with an expression that might have been approval. The place had a settled, comfortable look that spoke of care and attention. Nothing fancy, but everything in its proper place, suggesting a man who took pride in his surroundings, even if he lived alone. They rode down into the yard as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Cole's dog, a black and white border collie named Scout, came bounding out to greet them, tail wagging with the enthusiasm of a creature who'd been alone all day and was delighted to see his human return. Jake expected Elena to be startled or perhaps wary of the dog, but instead she slid down from Thunder before Cole could dismount and knelt to let Scout sniff her hands. What happened next made Cole's breath catch in his throat. Scout, who was typically reserved with strangers, immediately pressed against Elena's legs, his tail wagging so hard his entire body wiggled with joy. "Well, I'll be damned," Cole murmured as he dismounted. "Scout's taken to you right off. He's usually more cautious with new folks." Elena looked up at him, one hand still stroking Scout's head, and Cole saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. A kind of wonder, as if she were experiencing something unexpected and precious. It occurred to him that she might not have had much kindness from animals in her life, certainly not if her late husband had been the sort of man who gambled away his family's security. Cole showed her to the house's small guest room, a space he'd built but rarely used, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the pasture where his cattle grazed. He'd lit a lamp and set out fresh water and clean towels, trying to make the space as welcoming as possible for someone who probably hadn't experienced much hospitality in recent months. "You'll be safe here," he said simply, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. "The door has a good lock, and Scout sleeps on the porch. Nobody comes around here without him letting us know about it first." Elena nodded, her arms wrapped protectively around Sophia. For a moment they stood in the lamplight looking at each other, and Cole felt as if they were on the verge of some important understanding that neither was quite ready to voice. Then Elena stepped forward and, very gently, touched his arm just above the wrist. It was the briefest of contacts, but Cole felt its meaning like an electric current through his entire body. "Thank you," her touch seemed to say. "For the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm not afraid." Cole cleared his throat and stepped back, disturbed by his reaction to such an innocent gesture. "I'll be in the next room if you need anything. Morning comes early on a ranch, but don't feel obligated to rise with me. Rest as long as you need to." That night, Cole lay in his bed, listening to the familiar sounds of his ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, the wind through the pines, Scout's occasional movements on the porch. But underneath it all, he was acutely aware of the presence in the next room, of the woman and child who'd come into his life like a question he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Outside his window, stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow blessing this small corner of the world, where mercy had triumphed over profit, where kindness had conquered greed, and where a man's simple act of decency might just be the beginning of something extraordinary. The sound of Sophia's cry drifted through the thin walls, followed by Elena's soft voice singing a Spanish lullaby that spoke of protection and love. Cole found himself listening to the melody, letting it wash over him like a balm for wounds he'd thought would never heal. For the first time since Isabella's death, the future didn't look like an endless repetition of solitary days and empty nights. Whether that would prove to be salvation or destruction remained to be seen. But as Elena's voice faded into contented silence, Cole Morrison found himself hoping, against all logic and experience, for the former. The last thing he heard before sleep claimed him was thunder nickering softly in the corral, as if the horse too understood that their quiet world was about to change in ways none of them could yet imagine. Cole woke before dawn, as was his habit, but lay still in his bed listening to the sounds of morning creeping across his ranch. Bird song, the distant lowing of cattle, Scout's tail thumping against the porch boards, and something else. Soft footsteps moving around his kitchen, the quiet clink of pots and pans, the smell of coffee brewing and bacon frying. He dressed quickly and emerged to find Elena standing at his stove, expertly managing a pan of eggs while Sophia sat in an improvised high chair, made from a wooden crate and cushions. Elena had obviously been awake long enough to explore his kitchen, locate his supplies, and start a proper breakfast despite being in a strange house with a baby to tend. When she saw him, she nodded toward the table where a plate was already waiting, steam rising from perfectly prepared eggs, bacon, and biscuits that looked better than anything he'd managed to cook for himself in years of solitary living. "You didn't have to," Cole began, but Elena held up a hand and pointed to the coffee pot with a look that suggested he shouldn't argue with her when it came to kitchen matters. Cole sat down and took a bite. The eggs were seasoned with herbs he didn't even know he possessed, and the biscuits were light as clouds. "This is—" He paused, searching for words that could encompass his surprise and gratitude. "This is the best meal I've had in years, Elena. Thank you." She poured coffee for both of them, and Cole noticed the way she moved. Economical, purposeful, as if she'd been managing kitchens her whole life, despite being only 24 years old. But there was something else, something that made him watch her more closely. She would pause sometimes, her head tilted as if listening, though there was nothing to hear except the normal morning sounds of the ranch. After breakfast, Cole showed her around the property. They walked through the barn where his horses nickered softly at their approach, past the chicken coop where hens clucked contentedly, and out to the pasture where his cattle grazed in the morning sun. Elena took it all in with that same intense awareness he'd noticed the day before. But as they walked, Cole began to notice something remarkable. She would stop sometimes, seemingly at random, and look in a particular direction. Not with her eyes exactly, but with her whole body, as if something had called to her attention. The first time it happened, Cole looked where she was looking, but saw nothing unusual. The second time, he was about to ask what had caught her attention, when Scout came bounding over the hill from exactly the direction Elena had been facing. By the third time, Cole was paying closer attention. They were checking the fence line in the north pasture when Elena suddenly stopped and turned toward a stand of pine trees about a quarter-mile away. Her entire posture changed, alert, concerned, focused. She started walking in that direction without explanation, and Cole, puzzled but trusting, followed. They found the cow 20 minutes later, lying on her side in a small clearing, clearly in distress. She was one of Cole's best breeding cows, and it was obvious she was having trouble calving. Cole cursed under his breath. He should have been checking on her more carefully, should have seen the signs earlier. But Elena was already moving. She approached the laboring cow with calm confidence, her hands gentle but sure as she examined the situation. Cole watched in amazement as she seemed to communicate with the animal through touch and presence alone. The cow, which should have been panicked and dangerous, actually seemed to calm under Elena's ministrations. "How did you know?" Cole asked quietly as Elena positioned herself to help with the birth. "How did you know she was here, in trouble?" Elena glanced at him, and for a moment, her carefully maintained composure cracked. He saw something in her eyes, uncertainty maybe, or the memory of being questioned about things she couldn't explain and finding the experience painful. "It's hard to explain," she said softly, focusing on the cow. "I just feel things sometimes. When animals are in distress, when something's wrong, it's like a pull, a knowing." The birth took another hour, but Elena's presence seemed to make all the difference. The calf arrived healthy and strong, and the mother was soon on her feet, nuzzling her baby with obvious relief. Cole had assisted with dozens of births over the years, but he'd never seen anything quite like Elena's intuitive understanding of what the animals needed. As they walked back to the ranch house, Cole found himself thinking about the whispers he'd heard in town. Vague rumors about Miguel Rodriguez's strange wife, suggestions of unusual abilities that made some people uncomfortable. Now he understood what they'd been talking about, but where others had seen something to fear, Cole saw something wonderful. "Is that why your husband—" Cole began, then stopped himself. The question felt too intrusive, too painful to voice, but Elena seemed to understand what he was asking. She nodded once, her expression sad but resigned. Miguel didn't understand. Neither did his family or most people in town. They thought it was unnatural, dangerous. Some even suggested it was. She hesitated, then continued quietly. "Evil." "It's not evil," Cole said firmly. "It's a gift, Elena. A real gift. And anybody who can't see that isn't worth worrying about." Elena stopped walking and turned to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face for signs of deception or false comfort. What she found there must have satisfied her, because for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. Not the careful, polite expression he'd seen before, but a real smile that transformed her entire face and made Cole's heart skip in his chest. That afternoon, as they worked together around the ranch, Cole found himself watching Elena with new understanding. She had an uncanny ability to know which horses needed attention, which chickens were getting sick, even which parts of the fence were beginning to weaken under winter weather. It was as if she could feel the heartbeat of the entire ranch, could sense the health and happiness of every living thing on his land. Sophia seemed to share some of her mother's sensitivity. The baby was content around the animals in a way that suggested she felt safe and welcome, as if she understood that this was a place where she and her mother would be protected rather than exploited. When evening came, they sat on Cole's front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. Sophia played on a blanket at their feet, babbling contentedly while Scout kept protective watch nearby. The domestic scene felt surreal to Cole, who'd grown accustomed to spending his evenings alone with only his thoughts and regrets for company. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "For what?" "For not being afraid of what I am. For seeing it as something good instead of something to hide or be ashamed of." Cole turned to look at her, noting the way the fading light caught the highlights in her dark hair, the graceful line of her profile as she gazed out at his land. "Elena," he said softly, "what you have is precious. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." She reached out then and touched his hand, just briefly, but with a warmth that traveled straight to his heart. In that simple gesture, Cole felt the walls he'd built around himself begin to crack, letting in light he'd thought he'd never see again. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to understand each other, new chances to build something meaningful from the ashes of their separate sorrows. But tonight it was enough to sit together in the gathering darkness, two wounded souls learning to trust again, while a baby played at their feet and the Colorado sky blessed them with stars. For the first time in 5 years, Cole Brennan dared to hope that he might not have to face the future alone. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by the time Cole made his next trip to Copper Creek for supplies 2 weeks later, everyone knew about Miguel Rodriguez's widow living out at Eagle's Rest Ranch. The whispers followed Cole down Main Street like tumbleweeds in a dust storm, conversations that stopped when he approached and resumed in hushed tones when he passed. "Heard Brennan took in that strange Rodriguez woman. My sister says she's got unnatural ways with animals, knows things she shouldn't know. Miguel always said there was something peculiar about her." Cole kept his face impassive as he loaded supplies into his wagon, but his jaw was tight with suppressed anger. Elena had chosen to stay at the ranch that morning, saying she wanted to tend to a horse that seemed off its feed, but Cole suspected she'd wanted to avoid exactly this kind of attention. He was securing the last of his purchases when Mayor Harrison approached, flanked by 3 other men Cole recognized as prominent townsmen. Harrison was a portly man with thinning hair and the kind of self-important bearing that came from being a moderately successful businessman in a small pond. He'd never liked Cole much, too independent, too unwilling to play social games, and the feeling was mutual. "Brennan," Harrison said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of a man preparing to pry into matters that weren't his business. "Heard you've got some company out at your place." "If you've got something to say, Harrison, say it," Cole replied, not bothering to hide his irritation. "Now don't get your back up," Harrison said, holding up his hands in a gesture of mock peace. "We're just concerned is all. That woman, well, she's got a reputation. People are wondering if it's wise to have her so close to town." "What kind of reputation?" Cole asked, though he suspected he knew where this was heading. "Strange things happen around her," one of the other men said, Billy Hartman, who worked as a clerk in the general store. "Animals acting peculiar, people getting feelings they can't explain. Some say she's got the sight, knows things before they happen." "And that scares you?" Cole's voice was deadly quiet. "It's not natural," Harrison said firmly. "A woman shouldn't have that kind of influence. Makes people nervous, and nervous people make bad decisions for everyone involved." Cole straightened to his full height, and the men took an involuntary step back. At 6'2" and hardened by years of ranch work, Cole Brennan could be an intimidating presence when he chose to be. "Let me make something clear," Cole said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd faced down charging bulls and didn't scare easily. "Elena Rodriguez is under my protection. She lives on my land, works alongside me, and has done nothing but help every living thing that crosses her path. If that makes you nervous, I suggest you examine your own consciences." "Now see here, Brennan," Harrison began. "I'm not finished," Cole cut him off. "Elena has a gift, yes. She can sense when animals are in distress, when storms are coming, when something's wrong. Where I come from, we call that a blessing, not a curse. Any man who wants to make trouble for her will have to answer to me first." The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment, a commotion erupted from the direction of the schoolhouse. A woman's voice, high and panicked, cut through the afternoon air. "Help! Someone help us!" Cole and the other men rushed toward the sound, joining a crowd that was gathering around a young woman who stood wringing her hands outside the school steps. Cole recognized her as Mary Patterson, whose husband ran the blacksmith shop. "It's my Tommy," she was saying, tears streaming down her face. "He was playing near the old mine shaft east of town, and there was a cave-in. He's trapped, and we can't get to him. The opening's too narrow, and we're afraid if we try to dig, we'll bring more rocks down on him." A murmur of concern rippled through the crowd. The abandoned mine shaft was a known danger, but children were drawn to it despite repeated warnings. Cole knew the place, a narrow, unstable tunnel that had been worked out years ago and left to deteriorate. "How long has he been trapped?" Cole asked. "Maybe an hour," Mary sobbed. "We can hear him crying, but we can't reach him. Oh God, what if—" Her words were cut off by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Cole turned to see Elena riding hard toward town on Thunder, her hair streaming behind her like a dark banner. She pulled up at the edge of the crowd and slid from the saddle with urgent grace. She took one look at Mary's tear-stained face, then at the men standing helplessly around, and Cole saw understanding dawn in her dark eyes. Without a word, she started walking toward the east end of town, her pace quick and purposeful. "Where's she going?" Harrison demanded. "To help," Cole said simply, following Elena. The crowd trailed behind them, curiosity and desperation overriding their earlier suspicions. They reached the mine site to find Elena already kneeling at the partially collapsed entrance, her ear pressed to the ground. She listened for a long moment, then moved to different spots around the area, always listening, always alert. Finally, she stood and pointed to a spot about 15 feet from the main entrance, then began pulling away rocks and debris with methodical determination. Cole immediately moved to help her, as did several other men, though they exchanged uncertain glances. "How does she know where to dig?" someone whispered. "Maybe she doesn't," another voice replied. "Maybe she's just guessing." But Cole had seen Elena work with animals, had witnessed her uncanny ability to sense what was wrong and what was needed. He trusted her instincts completely, and he threw himself into the work with absolute faith. It took 30 minutes of careful digging, but finally they broke through to a small pocket where Tommy Patterson huddled, frightened but unharmed. The boy was barely 5 years old, covered in dust and tears, but alive. As his mother gathered him into her arms, sobbing with relief, the crowd fell silent. Elena stood apart from the celebration, brushing dirt from her hands, her face calm but tired. Cole saw the way people were looking at her now, not with fear or suspicion, but with something approaching awe. "How did you know?" Mary Patterson asked, approaching Elena with Tommy still clinging to her neck. "How did you know where to dig?" Elena looked at the woman for a long moment, then simply placed her hand over her heart and pointed toward Tommy. Mary's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for saving my boy." As the crowd dispersed and families headed back to their homes, Cole noticed that the whispers had changed. Instead of fear and suspicion, he heard wonder and respect. Word would spread quickly about what had happened here, about the woman who could hear distress where others heard only silence. But Cole also noticed Mayor Harrison and his companions hanging back, their expressions troubled. He had a feeling this wouldn't be the end of the questions about Elena, and that some people would never be comfortable with gifts they couldn't understand or control. As he and Elena rode back to the ranch in the gathering dusk, Cole reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "You did good today," he said quietly. "Real good." Elena squeezed back, and in that simple gesture, Cole felt all the gratitude and trust she couldn't put into words. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The evening brought unexpected visitors. Rebecca Martinez arrived just as they were finishing supper, her horse lathered from hard riding. She was Cole's nearest neighbor to the south, a widow who'd been running her small spread alone since her husband died 3 years earlier. More importantly, she was one of the few people in the territory who wasn't easily intimidated by gossip or social pressure. "Heard you had some excitement in town today," she said without preamble, accepting the cup of coffee Cole poured for her. "Tom Patterson stopped by my place on his way home. He's grateful, Cole. more grateful than words can express. Rebecca was a small woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd earned the respect of every rancher in the valley through sheer determination and competence, and she'd never been one to suffer fools gladly. "What else did Patterson tell you?" Cole asked. "Enough to know you might have trouble coming. Harrison and his crowd don't like being shown up, especially by someone they consider an outsider." Rebecca's gaze moved to Elena, who was cleaning dishes at the kitchen counter. "And some folks get mighty uncomfortable when they can't explain something." Elena turned from the sink, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Elena Rodriguez, ma'am. And yes, I'm afraid I'm the source of Mr. Brennan's current difficulties." Rebecca studied her for a moment, taking in the quiet dignity in the way Elena held herself. Protective, but not defensive. Wary, but not broken. "You're the widow from the debt auction. Heard Cole paid quite a sum for your freedom." "More than he should have," Elena said quietly. "And now it's causing him problems I never intended." "Intentions don't matter much when you're dealing with small-minded people," Rebecca replied. "What matters is having friends who'll stand with you when things get ugly." Cole looked up sharply. "Rebecca, I appreciate the thought, but this isn't your fight." "The hell it isn't." Rebecca's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having her decisions respected. "Harrison and his crowd have been pushing people around this valley for too long, deciding who belongs and who doesn't based on their own narrow prejudices. It's time somebody pushed back." Elena felt a flutter of hope in her chest, quickly suppressed. She'd learned not to trust in rescue, especially from unexpected sources. What could you possibly do against their influence and social standing? Rebecca smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. "Honey, I've been fighting powerful men since before you were born. The trick isn't matching their resources. It's making the cost of their bullying higher than they're willing to pay." Over the next hour, Rebecca outlined a strategy that was both simple and audacious. If Harrison and his allies wanted to cause trouble for Elena, they'd have to do it publicly, which meant involving the territorial authorities. That meant witnesses, documentation, and scrutiny that could cut both ways. "The last thing they want is official attention," Rebecca explained. "Too many questions about their own business practices, too much light on deals they'd rather keep in shadow. They're counting on you backing down rather than fighting." "And if we don't back down?" Cole asked. Rebecca's smile turned predatory. "Then we make sure any fight becomes very public and very expensive for them. I know people in the territorial capital, folks who owe me favors, and who'd be very interested in certain questionable activities that have been overlooked for too long." Elena listened to the conversation with growing amazement. Here were two people willing to risk everything to help a stranger, asking for nothing in return except the satisfaction of standing against injustice. It was so far outside her experience that she hardly knew how to process it. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you do this for me?" Rebecca looked at her with something that might have been maternal affection. "Because somebody has to. Because letting them win this time makes it easier for them to win the next time. And because," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "because I had a daughter once who could have used someone to stand up for her when she was different, when she didn't fit the mold people expected." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and Sophia's soft breathing from her crib near the hearth. Outside, the first winter wind rattled the windows, carrying the promise of harder times ahead. But for the first time since the confrontation in town, Elena dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, they might find a way to stand against the pressure without losing everything they'd begun to build together. The weeks following the mine rescue brought an unexpected change to their routine. Where once Elena had moved through the ranch with careful efficiency, now she worked with growing confidence. Her natural abilities complementing Cole's practical knowledge in ways that surprised them both. The rescued boy's mother had spread word of Elena's gift throughout the valley, and gradually neighbors began arriving with sick animals and mysterious problems that conventional wisdom couldn't solve. Elena never charged for her help, but grateful families brought gifts: fresh bread, preserved vegetables, warm quilts, and the kind of acceptance that money couldn't buy. Cole watched his isolated ranch transform into a gathering place, a beacon of hope for people who'd learned that sometimes the impossible was just another word for something they didn't understand yet. It was during one of these visits that Cole began to see Elena not just as someone under his protection, but as a woman whose presence had fundamentally changed his world for the better. She was helping Fernando Vega's mare through a difficult foaling, her hands gentle but sure as she guided new life into the world. The reverence on her face as the foal took its first breath, the joy that transformed her features. It was beautiful and heartbreaking, and everything Cole had thought he'd lost forever when Isabella died. "She's perfect," Elena whispered, watching the mare nuzzle her newborn. "Look how strong she is, how eager to live." Cole found himself watching Elena instead of the horses, noting the way motherhood had given her an additional dimension of tenderness, how her gift extended beyond sensing distress to celebrating life itself. When she looked up and caught him staring, something electric passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or the first stirring of something deeper than gratitude and respect. November brought the first snow, and with it a coziness to the ranch house that Cole had never experienced during his years of solitary living. Elena had taken over most of the cooking, transforming his simple meals into feasts that filled the house with warmth and wonderful smells. Sophia had begun pulling herself up on furniture, babbling in what sounded increasingly like real words, and treating Cole with the absolute trust that children reserved for people they considered family. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Sophia made her way across the room using furniture for support and collapsed into Cole's lap with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd accomplished something important. She looked up at him with Elena's dark eyes and said, clear as a bell, "Papa." The word hit Cole like a physical blow. He looked across at Elena, whose face had gone soft with an emotion too complex to name. She hadn't corrected Sophia's assumption, hadn't explained that Cole wasn't her father. Instead, she simply smiled with a warmth that made Cole's heart ache with longing. "She's never had a father figure," Elena said quietly. "Miguel died before she was born, and there's been no other man in her life who treated her with kindness." Cole looked down at the baby, who was now trying to grab his shirt buttons with determined concentration. The trust in her expression, the casual affection of a child who'd never known fear. It was a gift he hadn't realized he'd been desperate to receive. "Is that all right?" Elena asked, uncertainty creeping into her voice. "If she calls you that, I know it's presumptuous, but she's too young to understand the difference between legal relationships and chosen ones." "It's more than all right," Cole said, his voice rough with emotion. It's perfect." That night, after Elena had put Sophia to bed, they sat together on the front porch despite the cold, wrapped in quilts and watching stars wheel overhead in patterns that had remained unchanged since the world began. The intimacy of shared silence had deepened over the weeks, but tonight something else hummed in the air between them. Possibility, desire, the recognition that what had started as obligation was becoming something entirely different. "Cole," Elena said softly, breaking the comfortable quiet, "I need to tell you something." He turned to look at her, noting how the moonlight caught the highlights in her dark hair, how the cold had brought color to her cheeks. "What is it?" "I'm not the same person you bought at that auction. That woman was broken, defeated, convinced she deserved whatever suffering came her way. I'm not her anymore." Cole waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. "Living here, being treated with respect and kindness, having my gifts seen as something valuable instead of something shameful, it's changed me. You've changed me." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "And I think I've changed you too." Cole couldn't deny it. The man who'd lived like a hermit for 5 years, avoiding human connection and convinced that love only led to loss, had somehow become someone who looked forward to shared meals and quiet conversations, who found himself planning improvements to the ranch not just for practical reasons, but to make it a better home for the people he'd come to treasure. "Elena," he said carefully, "are you saying what I think you're saying?" She turned to face him fully, her dark eyes reflecting starlight and something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or the kind of courage it took to risk your heart after it had been broken before. "I'm saying that I love you, Cole Brennan, not as my benefactor or protector, but as a man who saw worth where others saw only burden, who gave me the freedom to be myself without apology. I love your gentleness with Sophia, your patience with me, the way you've created a place where broken things can heal." Cole felt his breath catch in his throat. He dreamed of hearing those words but hadn't dared hope they might be real, might be offered freely instead of out of obligation or gratitude. "I love you too," he said, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff into open air. "I think I've loved you since that first day, when you stood on that platform with your chin up and fire in your eyes. You were the bravest thing I'd ever seen." Elena smiled then, radiant with joy and relief. "So what do we do now?" Cole reached for her hands, marveling at how perfectly they fit in his. "Now we stop pretending this is temporary. Now we build something real together. A family, a future, a life worth living." "Is that a proposal, Mr. Brennan?" Cole laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "I suppose it is, Mrs. Rodriguez, though I should probably do it properly." He stood up, suddenly decisive, and dropped to one knee beside her chair. Elena's gasp of surprise was followed by tears of joy as he took her hand in both of his. "Elena Rodriguez," he said solemnly, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me adopt Sophia as my own daughter? Will you help me turn this ranch into the kind of place where love grows stronger instead of weaker? Where children laugh instead of cry? Where two people who thought they were too broken to love again can prove the world wrong?" "Yes," Elena said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes to all of it. Yes to everything." When Cole stood to kiss her, it was with the gentle reverence of a man who'd learned to treasure what was precious. Elena responded with the passion of a woman who'd discovered that love didn't have to hurt, that strength could be tender, and protection could be freely given. Inside the house, Sophia slept peacefully in her crib, oblivious to the moment that would reshape her entire future. Outside, snow began to fall on the Colorado mountains, blanketing everything in pristine white. The kind of snow that spoke of new beginnings, of slates wiped clean and fresh stories written in the tracks, of those brave enough to step forward into hope. The woman who'd been sold at auction had found love. The man who'd paid for her freedom had found his own liberation. And somewhere in the space between heartbreak and healing, a family had been born from the simple recognition that sometimes the most extraordinary things grew from the most ordinary acts of human decency. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love could overcome any obstacle. But tonight, it was enough to hold each other close and whisper promises under stars that had witnessed countless love stories, but never one quite like theirs. Spring arrived early in the Colorado Territory, painting the mountains in brilliant greens and golds that seemed designed specifically for celebration. Elena stood in the small bedroom that had been hers alone for 6 months, adjusting the ivory silk dress that Rebecca Martinez had insisted on commissioning from Denver. Today, she would walk down the aisle Cole had built in their front yard and become Mrs. Cole Brennan, not through legal obligation, but through choice, love, and the kind of commitment that transcended any contract. Sophia, now walking confidently and chattering in a mixture of Spanish and English, wore a miniature version of Elena's dress, complete with tiny silk shoes that would probably last until she took her first steps outside. At 15 months, she'd grown into a confident toddler who treated the ranch as her personal kingdom, and Cole as the father she'd never known she was missing. "You look like a princess, mija," Elena whispered, adjusting Sophia's dress as the baby reached for the lace curtains with determined curiosity. The transformation of the ranch for their wedding had been a community effort that still amazed Elena. Neighbors from throughout the valley had contributed labor, materials, and countless hours to create something magical from Cole's practical homestead. Tables groaned under the weight of food brought by dozens of families, each dish representing gratitude for what Elena and Cole had accomplished together. There was music provided by Fernando Vega's son, who played guitar with the skill of someone who learned from the Spanish masters. Flowers had been gathered from every garden within 50 miles, creating arrangements that transformed the ranch yard into something approaching paradise. But it was the guest list that truly demonstrated how much their lives had changed. Judge William Crawford had agreed to officiate, lending the ceremony an official gravity that reflected the respect Elena had earned throughout the territory. Rebecca Martinez served as matron of honor, having appointed herself to that role with the authority of someone who decided that Elena needed an older woman's guidance, whether she wanted it or not. Most surprisingly, Mayor Harrison and several other prominent townsmen who'd initially opposed Elena's presence had requested invitations, their attitudes transformed by months of witnessing her genuine kindness and the positive impact she'd had on the community. The woman they'd once feared had become someone they respected, admired, and perhaps most importantly, trusted. Cole waited beneath the massive cottonwood tree they'd chosen as their altar, wearing his best suit with a confidence that had been hard-won over months of growth and healing. The man who'd lived as a hermit for years now stood surrounded by friends and neighbors, no longer afraid of human connection or the possibility of loss. Elena's love had taught him that isolation wasn't protection, it was just another form of prison. As Elena walked toward him, Sophia balanced on her hip and her face radiant with joy. Cole felt tears threaten for the first time since Isabella's funeral. But these were tears of gratitude rather than grief, recognition of a happiness he'd thought was lost forever. Judge Crawford cleared his throat and began the ceremony with words that acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. "Dearly beloved," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "we are gathered here today to witness something remarkable, not just the marriage of two fine people, but the triumph of love over circumstance, hope over despair, and the power of human decency to transform lives." Elena felt tears threaten as she looked out at the faces surrounding them. Here were the neighbors who'd accepted her gift, the friends who'd supported Cole's decision to help a stranger, the community that had chosen love over fear. This wasn't just her wedding, it was a celebration of everything they'd built together. "Cole Brennan," Judge Crawford continued, "when you bid on Elena Rodriguez that day in Copper Creek, you weren't just buying her freedom, you were investing in the future of this entire community. Your courage inspired others to open their hearts, to look beyond surface differences, to believe that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences." Cole squeezed Elena's hands, feeling the strength in her fingers that had once trembled with fear. The woman standing beside him bore little resemblance to the broken creature he'd rescued from the auction block. This Elena stood tall and confident, her eyes clear and purposeful, her voice steady when she spoke her vows. "I promise to love you," she said, her words carrying across the silent gathering. "Not just as my husband, but as the man who showed me that strength could be gentle, that protection could be freely given, and that love didn't have to hurt." Her voice caught slightly on the last words, remembering the years when love had meant pain and fear. But those memories no longer defined her. They were simply part of the journey that had led her to this moment, to this man, to this new beginning. "I promise to honor you," Cole replied, his voice rough with emotion, "not just as my wife, but as the woman who taught me that broken things could be mended, that gifts came in unexpected forms, and that sometimes the most important rescues involve saving each other." Sophia chose that moment to reach for Cole's face with tiny hands, babbling something that sounded remarkably like approval. The crowd laughed as Cole gathered both Elena and Sophia into his embrace, including the child in the ceremony that would make their family official. "Do you, Cole Brennan, take Elena Rodriguez to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, for better or for worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Cole said firmly, looking into Elena's eyes with a love that had grown from admiration through shared struggle into something unshakable. "Do you, Elena Rodriguez, take Cole Brennan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, for better or for worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Elena replied, her voice strong and clear, carrying no trace of the fear that had once characterized every aspect of her life. "And do you both promise to love and protect Sophia as your own daughter, to raise her with wisdom and kindness, to give her the security and opportunity that every child deserves?" "We do," they said together, and Sophia clapped her hands as if she understood the significance of the moment. When Judge Crawford pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the crowd could be heard for miles. It was more than celebration. It was validation, confirmation that good people could still win, that love could still triumph over adversity, that ordinary acts of decency could still change the world. The reception that followed was unlike anything the territory had ever seen. There was dancing to Fernando's guitar, toasts that brought tears to hardened ranchers' eyes, and laughter that echoed across the valley like a promise of better days to come. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Cole and Elena stood together on their front porch, Sophia asleep in Elena's arms, watching their friends and neighbors celebrate around them. "No regrets?" Cole asked softly, settling his arm around his wife's waist. Elena leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength that had anchored her through the most difficult period of her life. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Only gratitude. For you, for this place, for the chance to build something beautiful from something broken." Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow blessing this small corner of the world where mercy had triumphed over profit, where kindness had conquered fear, and where a family had been forged from the ashes of separate sorrows. The auction block seemed like something from another lifetime, a nightmare that had somehow transformed into the greatest blessing Elena had ever received. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that love was stronger than circumstance. Tonight was for celebrating what they'd built together, a family, a community, a legacy of hope that would echo through generations. In years to come, the story would be told and retold throughout the territory. How a rancher's simple act of decency had sparked a transformation. How a widow's courage had inspired a community. How ordinary people had proven that sometimes, against all odds, love really could conquer everything. But the most important truth was simpler and more personal. The woman who'd been sold at auction had found her voice. The man who'd paid for her freedom had found his heart. And together they discovered that the most extraordinary love stories often began with the most ordinary acts of human kindness. As the last guest departed and the first stars appeared overhead, Cole and Elena Brennan stood together in the doorway of their home, surrounded by the quiet contentment of people who'd fought for their happiness and won. Sophia slept peacefully in her father's arms, for that's what Cole had become, in every way that mattered, while her parents planned a future filled with all the love, laughter, and hope that had been missing from their separate pasts. The woman who'd been bought had become a bride by choice. The man who'd been haunted by loss had found redemption in love, and the child who'd been born into uncertainty would grow up knowing that families weren't just made by blood, but by the daily choice to love, protect, and cherish each other through whatever storms might come. 5 years have passed since that autumn day in Copper Creek, and the story of Cole and Elena Brennan has become legend throughout Colorado territory. Their ranch has grown into something extraordinary, not just a successful cattle operation, but a place of healing where people bring their broken animals and broken hearts, knowing they'll find understanding and help. Elena's gift has only grown stronger with time and acceptance. She's become known throughout the territory as the listener, sought out by ranchers, farmers, and families who've learned that some problems require solutions that can't be found in any textbook. Her reputation has spread far beyond Colorado, with letters arriving from across the frontier asking for her guidance and wisdom. Their family has grown too. Sophia, now 6 years old, has been joined by 2 younger siblings. Little Miguel, named for Elena's first husband in an act of forgiveness that speaks to her generous heart, and baby Isabella, named for the woman whose memory taught Cole that love lost doesn't mean love is impossible. All 3 children show signs of inheriting their mother's extraordinary sensitivity to the natural world. Sophia can calm frightened horses with a touch. Miguel seems to know when storms are coming days before they arrive, and even baby Isabella appears to respond to the emotions of everyone around her. The ranch itself has become a symbol of hope throughout the region. Politicians and territorial officials make pilgrimages to Eagle's Rest, seeking Elena's counsel on matters ranging from livestock management to community building. She's been offered positions in Denver and even back east, but she's never been tempted to leave the mountains that gave her sanctuary when she needed it most. The love between Cole and Elena has only deepened with time, growing from the desperate gratitude of 2 wounded souls into something unshakable and eternal. They've weathered droughts and harsh winters, cattle rustlers and political upheavals, always together, always stronger as a unit than either could be alone. Their story has inspired others throughout the frontier. Debt auctions have become increasingly rare, as communities learn to support their most vulnerable members rather than exploit them. Laws have been passed protecting widows and orphans from the kind of legal abandonment that once threatened Elena and Sofia. But perhaps the most important legacy of their love story is simpler and more personal. 3 children who will grow up believing that families are built on choice rather than obligation, that differences should be celebrated rather than feared, and that love, real, true, accepting love, is the most powerful force in the world. As Elena often tells visitors who come seeking wisdom, sometimes the most extraordinary blessings come disguised as ordinary disasters. The key is learning to see the gift hidden in the chaos, the love waiting inside the fear, the family that can be built from the ashes of what was lost. What did you think of Cole and Elena's incredible journey from a heartbreaking auction to true love? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where someone's kindness completely changed everything? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. And if this tale of frontier love and second chances touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of romance, courage, and hope. Tomorrow we have another amazing story waiting for you, one that proves love always finds a way, even in the most impossible circumstances.